This course is sponsored by the Bob Woodruff Foundation. We would like to thank the Bob Woodruff Foundation for their generosity in making this course possible.
Hi, and welcome to this course entitled Documenting Best Practices. My name is John Sanchez, and I'm a former Navy SEAL and the CEO of Team Performance Institute, where I get the chance to speak nationally on leadership, teamwork, and the power of service. I'm excited to be here and talk with you about how to set up your collaborative for success and engaging in best practices. In our collaborative work to serve veterans, service members, and their families, it seems that there's never enough time or resources. Many collaborators have full-time jobs outside the collaborative, and even dedicated, well-funded backbone organizations have an endless list of responsibilities. That's why it's vital that we don't waste either time or resources reinventing the wheel. With a shared learning model that includes best practices, collaboratives can advance their work faster and more efficiently. This course will cover some essential considerations for capturing best practices in your organization. First, we'll define best practice for the purposes of this course. Then we'll review some of the barriers to capturing best practices. We'll briefly explore how to foster a collaborative culture that enables organizational learning. And we'll talk about how to identify, validate, codify, and share best practices. Lastly, we'll cover some tips for integrating best practices in your organizational learning strategy. So, what is a best practice? Different sectors and industries may use different terms for best practice, but the meaning is essentially the same. A best practice is a technique or method that has demonstrated the ability to produce a desired outcome. By their nature, best practices are relative, and the term implies that the method or technique has been compared with others and found to work better. A best practice is by no means a guarantee of success. These practices exist at the intersection of tried and true and innovation. It's important to understand that for our purposes, best practices are not meant to be rigid or prescriptive. Rather, they're meant to be adapted to the environments and scenarios where they're employed. What are the barriers to capturing best practices? Well, there are a number of reasons that organizations, including collaborators, may not capture best practices. First is the eternal struggle of not enough time. You and your collaborative members are busy. Second, lacking a strategy by which to collect and assess information. Collaborators will find it difficult to identify what's working. Third, a scarcity mindset, the feeling that there's not enough to go around. So in order for some of us to succeed, others must fail, may prevent collaborators, especially those who compete for funding, from sharing what they've learned. Fourth is the issue of silos, an organizational approach in which resources like information is stored rather than shared. Silos can exist both within and between organizations and inhibit our capacity to learn from and grow together. Next, lack of an organizational learning strategy, what NVI calls shared learning, means there's no formal infrastructure through which to identify and share knowledge. And lastly, risk aversion is also a contributing factor. Collaborators who are worried about failing to maintain the status quo instead of trying something new. Let's pause to reflect. List the barriers that hamper best practice collection and sharing in your collaborative. After the video, return to this list and write one tactic you might be able to use to lower each barrier. How can collaborative culture enable organizational learning? It's incumbent on collaborative leaders to establish a culture of continuous learning. Collaborative leaders can make room for curiosity and vulnerability by modeling these behaviors and by overtly inviting curiosity and questions from members. In a culture of continuous learning, leaders are willing to examine what isn't working with a constructive mindset instead of shame, blame, or maybe even avoidance. It's also vital that collaborative leaders set conditions that support openness. One example is to establish meeting protocols that encourage respectful disagreement. Seek feedback early and often. Feedback in person and also via survey enables stakeholders to co-create solutions with you and gives them a stronger sense of ownership. Lastly, supportive collaborative leadership encourages creativity, improvement, and learning by valuing failure as part of the learning process and rewarding both sharing and adoption of best practices. Pause to reflect. List 3 ways you enable a learning culture in your collaborative and one new method you can try. How to identify best practices. The first step to codifying best practices is identifying them. Collaboratives can identify best practices by considering both formal and informal informational inputs. Formal information can include analysis of collaborative data. Data may demonstrate a pattern linking practices with favorable outcomes. Once you've noticed a pattern, you have an opportunity to examine whether there is a correlation between the two. Surveying case studies is another formal informational channel. Unless you're in a mature collaborative, chances are you'll need to start with informal information. Informal information can include anecdotal evidence based on day-to-day stakeholder experience, or observations by community leaders about patterns they observe in their work, and communication with constituents. Questionnaires, surveys, or interviews with the veterans and service members that your collaborative serves can also be useful sources of input. Using either formal or informal information, assess whether a practice is working. Does it solve a problem? Does it result in success? Does it have a positive impact? If it does, you have a solution on your hands. The next questions you can ask yourself will determine whether your solution might be a best practice. Is it effective at solving a common problem? Is it an efficient use of resources? Is it replicable? Bonus points if it's scalable. If you answer yes to all these questions, you have a best practice on your hands. The next part of the challenge is in documenting the practice. Documenting best practices. Capturing certain information is crucial to documenting best practice. Before you provide details, it's important to frame the context. Establish the setting in which the practice was used and how it worked to solve the problem. Once you've captured the context, you'll want to answer these questions. Who is the target user? Is this practice meant for civic leadership, veteran service officers, outreach workers, business owners? Be specific. Specificity here will help ensure that your collaborative members can select a best practice that meets their needs and is properly staffed. What issue or problem does the practice address? Be specific. Is this an issue of high drop-off rate after initial outreach contact with homeless veterans? Sharing data between agencies? Transportation in a certain area? Who does the practice impact? The who should include any actors and stakeholders, as well as the people being served, if applicable. Which collaborative goals does the practice support? Connecting the best practice in your collaborative's common agenda ensures that you're recording relevant learning. It also helps you categorize learning thematically so that your colleagues can find best practice when the problem arises again. Next, you'll want to document the how of the best practice. Think in terms of both actions and resources. What did you do? What did you use? Inclusion of resources is key. This will help your colleagues determine whether they have access to the appropriate resources to employ this best practice. In addition to recording what you put into practice, you'll want to record the outcomes. Be sure to include any measurable impacts. When capturing best practices, we have a unique opportunity to tell our colleagues what we wish we'd done differently. These recommendations, based on experience, are valuable to colleagues adapting the practice to their unique environment and needs. Sharing best practices. Best practices are codified because they help our collaboratives become better and more efficient. Sharing them helps us succeed beyond the borders of our own organizations and build healthy ecosystems and effective communities of practice. So, how do we share the practices we identify as best? Well, here are 3 ideas. 1, carve out a small chunk of time in a regular meeting, maybe the first 5 or 10 minutes, to discuss what's working well and how. This is an informal method that encourages regular sharing and gives your organization learning momentum. 2, carve out a bigger chunk of time, an afternoon, a retreat, or even a conference call to host a best practices summit. Ask participants to bring at least one best practice to present and contribute to a shared repository. 3, create a template for sharing best practices and host them digitally, accessible to all collaborative members. Ensure that they're browsable, searchable, or ideally both. Your library should be organized, filterable, or sortable by theme, location, target user, and collaborative goal. Unfortunately, your best practices won't maintain themselves. Set your collaborative up for success by clarifying who is responsible for submitting, collecting, reviewing, disseminating, and maintaining some of your best practices. Establish a schedule to accomplish this work at regular intervals. Let's pause to reflect. What type of process or schedule would work best for your collaborative? Do you have a member or perhaps members within the capacity to run point on a best practice initiative? Identifying, capturing, and sharing best practices is a critical part of your collaborative shared learning strategy. It requires some effort and organization, but the progress you can make in serving your community's veterans is worth it. Take a look at the resource kit below this video. It has templates, lists, further reading to get you started. You can also watch our course, Developing Models for Shared Learning, which discusses other components of organizational learning strategies. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to learn about this important topic and about our nation's military, veterans, and their family members. If you have any questions about this course or need assistance, please visit the PsychArmor website or call the PsychArmor support line at 844-779-2427.